With the Mahakumbh underway, I came across this very interesting article talking about how to prevent over-tourism and if indeed it can be stopped. This is not from the point of view of an Indian tourist location or an Indian festival. For years in Dubrovnik, Croatia, over-tourism has happened. It is almost the poster child for over-tourism because the summer visitors vastly outnumber the local population, and the municipal government repeatedly has introduced measures to diminish the size and impact of a flood of tourists that turns the historic center into a crowded parking lot of selfie snappers. I think people all over the world can relate with this phenomenon, either from the point of view of a tourist caught up in a hugely crowded tourist location or from the point of view of a local living in a very famous tourist location. But you would never know about the negative effects of so many visitors from the Croatian Ministry of Tourism's recent triumphant announcement noting that arrivals to the city had increased 9% in 2024 compared to 2023. By all parameters, we achieved another record year, the tourism minister was quoted as saying. This is the tourism minister of Croatia, of course. If 2024 was the year in which concerns about over-tourism achieved a critical mass in places around the globe, sparking protests from Amsterdam to the Canary Islands and triggering new regulations from Iceland to Indonesia, it was also the year in which it became clear just how complicated reducing tourism once it is unleashed can be. This year will see even more locations enact measures, this year being 2025. But the evidence on how or even whether tourism can be constrained remains scarce. Competing economic interests have a way of impeding attempts to stem the tourist tide. Rachel Dodds, professor of tourism management at Toronto Metropolitan University, said, "The hard truth is that once over-tourism has arrived, it's exceedingly difficult to turn back the clock." As early as 2010, tourism experts observed that some destinations were approaching or had exceeded their carrying capacity. By the middle of the last decade, cities like Amsterdam and Barcelona had begun taking tentative steps to relieve tourism's impacts on infrastructure, housing, the environment, and quality of life. But it was only after the pandemic, when revenge travel brought greater numbers of visitors to more destinations, that efforts to apply the brakes became more widespread. This year, travelers will feel the effects of those efforts. New legislation regulating Airbnbs and other short-term rentals goes into effect in France, the Czech Republic, and Greece, where a 24.5% surge in foreign visitors in 2024 over the previous year is also behind an increased tax up to €20 a day for cruise passengers on the islands of Santorini and Mykonos. Ports from Ibiza, Spain to Juneau, Alaska are restricting the number of cruise ships that can dock simultaneously, and in Juneau's case will be cutting back on the number of passengers allowed each day. Bruges, Belgium has halted new hotel construction, and Amsterdam, after imposing a similar measure in 2024, only to discover that some accommodations were exploiting a loophole, passed another measure in November that prevents them from adding more rooms or beds to their existing offerings. In Italy, tourists will be limited to 20,000 a day in Pompeii, and new legislation in Florence may prevent tourists from using golf carts to tool around. I don't know what is tool around. Maybe they were talking about fooling around. That's a new verb I have heard about, tooling around. New Zealand will require visitors to pay a tourist tax of 100 New Zealand dollars or about 57 US dollars, about 3 times higher than it was for most of 2024, while the Galapagos Islands has doubled its fee to 200 US dollars. In Japan, the mountain town of Ginzan Onsen recently joined Mount Fuji and some streets in Kyoto in restricting tourist numbers. And in South Korea, authorities have imposed a curfew in a historic neighborhood of Seoul to dampen tourist excesses. The major issue is that for many, many years, we have been utilizing an extractive model of tourism that says numbers at any cost. Now we are in a situation where all these kinds of things are being implemented, like restricting numbers and tourist taxes as reactive strategies. This is what Marina Novelli, the director of the Sustainable Travel and Tourism Advanced Research Center at the University of Nottingham, said. Whether these strategies will work remains to be seen. The evidence is spotty and suggests that measures take a long time to have an effect. Barcelona, for example, implemented its first tourist tax in 2012, began restricting short-term rentals in 2015, and capped new hotel construction in 2017. Yet, tourists continued to arrive in record numbers through the first third of 2024. It was only at the end of 2024 that the annual rate of arrivals showed a modest 0.7% decline over 2023. In Amsterdam, which began targeting overtourism in 2016, arrivals are expected to climb to 26 million in 2026. Curbing numbers is not always the primary aim. Capping short-term rentals, for example, is frequently posed as a solution to housing shortages, while tourist taxes can be intended to offset the strain that overtourism can place on resources. Some places like New Zealand and Hawaii are trying to do it as more of a regenerative or stewardship measure, while in others like Venice it is punitive, slapping a tax on and thinking it would persuade people not to come. Ms. Dodd said. Set at an amount roughly equivalent to a coffee and cornetto, Venice's €5 fee introduced last year was hardly dissuasive. Venice seems to have reached the same conclusion. This year, the rate doubles to €10. Will that have more of an impact? According to Co Coens, a professor of urban tourism at in Holland University for the Applied Sciences, no one knows. I can tell you for sure that €5 would not work, but we don't have enough data to know how high it has to be in order to work. Other measures in Venice have also come up short. The city recently began diverting cruise ships from its historic center. While the initiative may lessen environmental damage, it has not had any discernible effect on passenger numbers. In the fall of 2024, Venice predicted a 9% increase for the year over 2023, thanks to its newly distributed ports. In fact, restricting passengers in one area may channel overtourism to a different area. It's like a waterbed, Mr. Cohen said. By spreading people out to other places, you are potentially increasing overtourism issues. New York City began enforcing a pre-existing ban on short-term rentals last year, that is in 2024. The measure, which some experts correlate to 2024's 7% increase in hotel rates over the previous year, has sent tourists to surrounding areas where the rentals are legal. New Jersey has become the fastest growing market for Airbnb demand in the United States, according to the analytics site AirDNA. Yet, it does not appear to have reduced the number of tourists to New York itself. The city expects to surpass its previous record of 66.6 million in 2019 by 1.4 million in 2025. The greatest obstacle to solving overtourism may be the lack of consensus that it is actually a problem. As a source of revenue and employment globally, tourism generated a record $1.6 trillion in 2024. That's trillion with a T. Travel is an engine for economic growth. Because of that role, most attempts to limit tourism face opposition. Witness the recent decision to repeal Bali's planned moratorium on new hotel construction. Mato Frankovic, the mayor of Dubrovnik, has experienced that resistance. After he reduced the number of cruise ships, restricted rentals in the old town, and cut the number of tables and chairs in outdoor cafes by 30% and the number of souvenir stands by 70%, international and local businesses rebelled. The opposition was saying I was going to ruin the city, Mr. Frankovic said. He persevered. This year, the city will reduce the number of taxis, introduce apps that regulate tour bus arrivals and direct visitors to alternative sites at peak times, and enact national legislation that requires apartment owners in multi-dwelling buildings to obtain the consent from 80% of other residents before they can rent their apartment. Yet, even when municipal or regional authorities are determined to make changes, they can find themselves pitted against a national government that prioritizes economic growth. Take Copenhagen. The city council approved a tourist tax in 2024 as a nice way to prevent us from ending up like Barcelona, said Rasmus Steenberger, a member of the municipal government. But the national government, which is currently expanding Copenhagen's airport and recently announced a plan to increase tourism revenue to 200 billion kroner per year, that is about 28 billion US dollars, from 152 billion kroner by 2030, rejected the proposed tourist tax. Such conflict is why many experts believe more profound changes are needed. Ms. Dodds of Toronto Metropolitan University said that a solution requires rethinking the definition of success. United Nations tourism still measures success by the number of arrivals, which essentially is perpetuating the problems of over-tourism. So the conversation needs to be, how do we change the metrics of success? There are signs that new metrics are emerging. Both Bruges and Norway pulled tourism advertising campaigns last year, and some cruise and tour companies have voluntarily scratched Santorini and Mykonos from their itineraries for 2025 and 2026. But with international arrivals globally expected to grow 12.4% in 2025 over their 2019 levels, over-tourism seems likely to spread, especially with the advent of YouTube traveler channels, which really make traveling seem like a breeze and a very attractive proposition. Let's conclude with the pertinent words of University of Nottingham's Miss Novelli. I'm not sure there is a solution, unless it's people taking responsibility and saying, you know what, I don't need to see Venice. I'm not going to go.